Welcome back to the Cannonball Mindset, and we've had a lot of amazing athletes. We've had New York Times best-selling athletes. We have business CEOs. We had a great ultra runner, Charlie Engle, good friend of ours. Charlie Engle has been on the podcast several times. But this guy is probably like he's the Yoda of of ultra running. He's the Yoda of ultra running, and this is why you get a guy who can run the races he's run. But then write a book that resonates not just with runners, but with anybody that's looking for betterment or growth in their life or have had struggles or challenges in life. And so I picked up this book, The Rise of the Ultra Runners, because I was interested in running an ultra marathon. And, after I read the book, I start doing research on the author. Adharanand Finn is the author, and he's something special. And so we were able to track him down. He was gracious enough to come on the podcast. Let me tell you a little bit about him. He lives in the United Kingdom. He's got 3 children, right? Beautiful bride, 3 children. He's an author. He's a journalist. He has an amazing podcast where he interviews some of the most amazing people and runners. He just interviewed or just had on his Kipchoge. If you're a runner, it's like Oprah. The guy's got one name, Kipchoge. Fastest marathon runner in the world, one of the fastest human beings in the world. He's written several books, The Way of the Runner, Running with the Kenyans, and my favorite, The Rise of Ultra Runners. So I'm really excited to introduce Adharanand Finn to the podcast. Thanks for coming on.
It's nice to be here. Thanks for the intro.
This is awesome because I was telling you before we got on that probably less than 10% of my listeners, and it's a total guess, are runners or see themselves as runners. Now there is because I'm an avid runner. I do have a population that run, and people might be thinking, well, all right, well this is going to be about running, and yeah, there'll be some conversations in this podcast, I'm sure, about running, but that's really not. You can pick up The Rise of the Ultra Runner, and still not be a runner and get stuff out of it. You will be motivated to want to go run. There's no question. Like you're gonna be like, that's it. I'm tackling the 700-mile run. So tell us a little bit about yourself, and then we'll get into The Rise of the Ultra Runner and just your story.
Yeah, well, I mean, I guess I definitely wrote this as a book which was about running, but I wanted to see it as something that could be read by anyone, because to me there are these kind of fascinating worlds out there, these kind of subcultures, if you like, that exist in various parts of the world and in various sports and other domains. And some of them are just fascinating. Why anybody would want to go and run for 100 miles, 200 miles or further. It was just like a fascinating subject to me. I was a runner. I am a runner. So I go, and my style is what they call it gonzo journalism, where you go and you write from the inside. You tell the story from the inside. So you're not just standing on the outside watching, but you get involved. So the book is me going and running a whole bunch of ultra marathons. And before the book, I'd never run an ultra marathon. I had done about probably 4 or 5 marathons, which I was taking quite seriously. But I was quite a serious road runner. I was very much into like times and splits and hitting paces and getting personal best times. And then ultra running and trail running to me was a bit like, it didn't really appeal to me. It was I tried trail running and you're kind of tripping over the whole time, running up mountains. I watched the ultra running and they're hiking up the mountains with bags on their backs and holding poles. And I'm like, that's not running. That's easy. Anyone could do that. Like, they're just walking. Anyone could do that. So I thought actually ultra running would be kind of easy, a bit more like hiking and just having some fun time out in the wild. I didn't realize there's a reason why they're walking in that it's hard. It's really hard. But I was just kind of fascinated by the whole concept. What drives people to get out there? What drives people to and not only get out there, but people get addicted to it. People go back for more and they want to do more, and they get, there's a real draw to it. And I was really fascinated by what is pulling you back to do these things which are really hard and really torturous. And the first ultra marathon I did, there was this German couple in their like mid-60s. And it was on like day 4 of this race across the desert in Oman. And we were all, by this stage, we were like kind of brutalized. We were like exhausted. We hadn't eaten properly for days, hadn't slept properly, been in the hot sun, skin flaking off, blisters and everything. And the wife said, why do we do this? We have such a nice home. And the husband says, because we have such a nice home. And so that really rang. That made me think. Oh, there's something going on here. There's a kind of need to get away from our comfort and our easy lives, and which aren't always easy. But there's a kind of need to put ourselves out in the wild and kind of test ourselves and live this, at least
Yeah.
for a short period of time, this kind of difficult experience. So,
This
so I
this
was
discomfort.
fascinated by all that, and that drew me in, and I ended up, yeah, I still love running on the roads, but I'm a fully fledged trail runner these days. I got sucked in, yeah.
That's interesting because my first I am a road runner. I've done 35 marathons on the
Right.
road, no problem. I've done one trail ultra, two trail ultras, the JFK 50 miler, which is on
Oh yeah,
the Appalachian Trail and
yeah,
Ceno Path, and I said the same thing. I said this ultra running, man. This is, well, one, I'm 6'8", right? So it's like
right,
people think I'm Sasquatch chasing them in the woods, but the
yeah,
idea. The idea is like you're going up and down these mountains, and I'm not graceful. I'm tripping over tree branches, and you got to pay attention the whole time. And but it is something different. It is very much different than the road running as far as mentality, as far
yeah.
as process. What was your start? Like at what point? What was the kindle? What was the trigger that got you into the, like, all right, I'm going to explore trail running. I'm going to look at it. I'm going to research and I'm going to start doing it.
Well, it's a bit silly, really. I'd written my first two books, which are basically about road running mostly. They're about running with the Kenyans. It was about the great Kenyan runners. And I went to Japan and wrote about the Japanese kind of these epic relay races, but they're all road races. And through that process, I myself had got quite serious in my own running. I mean, all relative. I was still an amateur runner, but it was all on the road. And then, but I was also, as having written two books, I was also a journalist. I was writing articles for newspapers, and the Financial Times, which is a big paper over here, contacted me, and they'd obviously been told, "Oh, he's a journalist and he's a runner." And they wanted someone to go to Oman and do the Oman Desert Marathon, which was 5 days, 100 miles across sand in the desert in Oman. And they contacted me and said, "Would you do this for a travel piece?" And I just instantly said no. I said, "No, you've got the wrong guy. I don't do that kind of stuff. I'm not interested. That's not what I do." And then I spoke to my wife, and who's not a runner. So she was like, "You're being paid to go to Oman
Right.
and go run a race, and that's a job, and they're a really good newspaper. We're going to pay really well. You're going to get people. How much does this race cost to enter? Well, it's like £2,000 to enter. So like people are paying that much money. So that's like what, $2,500 or something.
Yeah.
People are paying that much to enter this race, and you're being offered it for free. You're going to get paid. I thought you liked running," she said. What's wrong with you?" And so I took my kind of runner hat off for a second, like my kind of slightly nerdy road runner hat. And I just thought, well, as a runner, maybe this isn't what I'm up to, but as an experience, as a life experience, as something to kind of tell the grandchildren about. I ran 100 miles across the desert, and one of the stages was at night, and I suddenly got this image of running through the desert at night, the stars. And I thought, well, what a thing to have experienced, what a thing to have lived through. And so I got back to the editor and said, yeah, I'll do it actually. And it was interesting because he said, well, you don't have to do the whole thing, just do a day or two, because it's 5 days.
Right.
But then I was all in. I was like, no, if I'm going to do it, I'm going to do the whole thing. And it was on that event in that race that I kind of got sucked in. So I wasn't what I was expecting at all. I went off first few days. I went off with the leaders, thinking, these guys not really runners, like I say. And I was doing quite well actually for the first few days, and then as the kind of days kind of started to compound against each other, I got completely destroyed on like day 4. I was in the top 20 and I ended up last that day. Hours behind, even the really people. There was a blind woman who was in her like 60s, and she finished ahead of me, and I just completely fell apart. And I swore I would never do this ever again. I hated this, and this was stupid. But afterwards, so it's really got under my skin. I just felt like I'd had this real kind of epic experience. It wasn't anything. It wasn't about running anymore. It was about like being raw, being kind of out in a place where you were really struggling, and you really had to kind of dig deep in yourself and find a way through it. And all those kind of experiences have kind of got under my skin. And also the fact that in the end, because the last 2 days I did terribly, I didn't do very well in the race, then the competitive side of me was like, you got to do one of those and do it properly. Take it seriously, put some effort in. not think
Yeah.
you're going to be able to win it or anything like that. And so it kind of drew me back. And then I started meeting the ultra runners, and they were really interesting people. I found, so on this stage race, so you kind of run for 4 or 5 hours, and then that was the end of that stage. And then you would all hang out together in these Berber tents in the desert. And there was an Italian guy called Dino who used to we all in the same tent each day. I just ended up in a tent full of Italians who loved to talk, and they'd be talking. But this guy Dino would hold court. And at one point he just said to me, if you go to the crazy places, you meet the crazy people. And something in me as a journalist, that kind of sparked a bit of interest as well. I kind of noticed that there were lots of really interesting people with interesting backstories who a lot of them had been through quite extreme experiences in their lives to get to this point where they were out in the desert, running across the desert. And so I thought, as a journalist, there was some good subject material here. And then the third thing that kind of really kind of sealed that this is something I have to write about, it was when I was back in the office afterwards. In fact, this was before, actually. It was a thought that came back to me. And at this point, I was still running marathons. And the guy comes up to me at the tea point. I was making a cup of tea. And some guy I didn't know says, "Oh, you're a runner, aren't you? I heard you're a runner." And I was like, "Yeah, I'm a runner." He said, "Oh, do you run ultra marathons?" And I was like, "No, I don't run ultra." He said, "Oh, do you do triathlon?" I was like, "No, I don't do triathlon." He said, "What, just marathons?" And it was that just marathons. It made me realize, that we kind of entered a new stage in like the progression of running and challenges, and like marathons were kind of commonplace now. And so all those things combined, I couldn't kind of look away, and I realized there'd obviously been a lot of books about ultra running, but mainly from one person's perspective, or there were either these kind of elite ultra runners telling their story, or there were these people who'd never run a day in their life, and then decided to run an ultra marathon, and that kind of story. But no one had kind of taken a journalistic approach to it, and kind of really kind of dug into the reasons and the world of ultra running, and kind of met lots of the different characters and told their stories, and so I just embarked on this journey, and the more I did, the more I got sucked in, and the more I realized it was a lot more difficult than it looked, which is kind of ironic because obviously running 100 miles looks difficult on the surface. But I had some twisted idea about it.
What's funny is you said, I was just at my brother's this week. My brother's a runner, and he's running a lot of marathons. We're doing the world majors together, and I was showing him my goals for 23. I'd written them out, my health goals and the events I was going to, just in health and the events I was going to do. And I have, like, I'm starting next month. I do the Tokyo Marathon, and then I do a half Ironman, and then an Ironman, and then New York City I'm doing for the 5th or 6th time, and then I get to. And he goes, "Well, look, these marathons aren't goals. What do you? These are just marathons." And he's being serious. And I was like, "What do you mean?" He goes, "Chad, you've run 35 marathons in the last 5 years. How are you're going to say that a marathon is that's not a goal anymore?"
Yeah.
And I'm like, I have to get to, in order to, like, in my mind, to be respected, I now have to I'm running a 100 mile. I'm running a Daytona 100 miler, and he's like, "Oh, now that's a goal. Like, you're doing a 100 miler. I don't even know if the JFKs are going." I'm like, what kind of world are we living in, to you, what your point was, where marathons have come almost commonplace?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's just a kind of natural inflation there. The more people that do it, and particularly if if you're doing it for, and it sounds wrong, but we are kind of, so there's part of us, ego plays a role. People don't like to admit that, but ego is there, and when you tell someone you're going to run 100 miles, or you put it on Facebook or something that you're running 100 miles, people are like amazed. They're like, they're impressed, and suddenly, that's like you say, people go, "That's a real goal," and you're like, "Okay, it's a real goal." Like I really like 10K running. I've run 34 minutes. I'd love to run 33 minutes, but if I go around telling everyone I'm trying to run 33 minutes 10K, it doesn't mean anything to anyone. Nobody's impressed. So these big epic runs are impressive. Like, even though to a serious runner, you go, yeah, 33 maybe is more impressive than finishing 100 miles. But so there's that, and then I think there's the adventure side of it as well. It's more than running. It's like running is, especially, I mean, a marathon is as well. It's all relative. Like, if you've never done a marathon's a huge goal.
Yeah,
but if you've done 35, your brother's right. It's like, okay, you've shown you can do that. You probably run your best time somewhere among there that you're not going to beat again. Maybe, I don't know.
Right.
yeah, let's up the game a bit. Let's kind of
That's
in
right.
a way, you're experiencing that same experience you felt the first time you did the marathon. That first time I ran a marathon, I was in tears afterwards. I'd done
Yeah, same
something I
here.
hadn't thought was, well, I knew it was possible, but I hadn't realized just quite how big it was going to feel to have done that. And the first marathon, yeah, I was in tears and the emotions were raw. But by the fifth or sixth marathon, it was a bit more commonplace. And you kind of want to get back to that
Mm,
real raw emotion that you get when you really do something which you didn't know if it was possible, and
yeah,
you had no, you kind of entering the unknown. There's that element of stepping outside your comfort zone and taking a risk and taking a chance. And if
yeah.
you've done 35 marathons, then although it's, it's still an amazing thing to experience and go to a new city and everything else, but it's not. Yeah, I can
Not
see
the
it's
same,
not
right?
quite the
Yeah,
same.
I think
Yeah.
that's if you go into there's a great book called the Molecule of More, and it talks about dopamine, the dopamine
Okay. Yeah. Yeah.
rush you have, and so. You're right. The first marathon I ever ran was the New York City Marathon. You get this huge dopamine rush. I'm
Yeah.
crying afterwards. I can't believe I
Yeah.
just did this. And
Yeah.
then I said, of course, I'm never doing it again.
Yeah. Yeah.
But you're right. Now the dopamine is like, what can I? But do you think that's why people are now? Why there's such a rise in? There's absolutely a rise in marathon running.
Yeah.
Do you think that? And do you think that's why there's now a rise in like all these levels? The marathon runner, the ultra marathon. I'm saying 30 years ago, 30 years ago, and because maybe it's because of social media and the way the communication works now, but nobody would have known who Kipchoge is. But
Yeah.
Kipchoge is a bona fide star right now, and
Yeah.
he's a
Yeah.
runner, right? But
Yeah.
he is on like it used to be, Willie Mays and Babe Ruth; those were the idols. But now you're getting like runners
Yeah.
as
Yeah.
these like status symbols, these celebrities, because running is just so prevalent in our culture right now. Do you see
Yeah.
that?
Yeah. Yeah. I think one goes with the other. I think the more people who do a marathon, eventually people are going to like that. They're going to enjoy it. They're going to go back to it. But then they're going to want to look, where do I go next with this? And so as marathon running goes, the more and more people run a marathon, then people are going to be looking what's next. And then the then the social media comes in where it spreads the word. So you see this guy you used to run with has done 100 miles, and you're like, I can run with him. He's just done 100 miles, and look at that amazing place he was. He was in these mountains, and look how look how happy he looks, and look how everyone is like loving him for it, and that looks like quite a journey he's been on, and I think when you see people you know, or people you ran with, or even people you don't know, but you kind of feel like they're your age or they're your size, it makes it seem possible, and I think social media has that plays that role of spreading the word of I mean, I think there's always been an element with running which is quite interesting, that you can actually run with the stars. You're in the same event. I mean, that's always been there, and that's an amazing thing about running. But that hasn't really changed. There's been whoever's the best in the world, you can kind of line up in the same race. There's no other sport you can do that, which
That's right.
is, and the same in ultra running. You go to some of these big ultra runs, and even some of the smaller ones. If you get it, a race, someone like Jim Walmsley is running some local race. You turn up and you're there, standing next to him on the start line. it's like
Do a double
it's like
take.
yeah, it's amazing. So I think, but yeah, I think social media has definitely made it seem like something. You see it, you see people doing it. It gives you the idea. It also makes it feel possible, and it really spreads the word. So it has played a role, definitely.
You said something, and maybe well, I know you talk about it in the book, but that you see that some of the people that are running, and then you might even use the word most of the people that are running, have had really difficult backgrounds, really difficult lives, and why do you think that is? Because I find that to be true. I talk to people. I'm like,
Yeah,
you're running all these marathons, you're running the ultras, you're doing this. A good friend of ours is Charlie Ingle, who ran across the continent of Africa. Right, he wrote an
yeah,
amazing book. I'm saying the guy's unbelievable, but his backstory is just riddled with like drug addiction and
yeah.
arrest and like the worst kind of background. Why is it that running sometimes, most of the time, gravitates towards these broken or at one point broken individuals?
Yeah, and I think it's probably more ultra running than like
Yeah,
even marathon running, and definitely shorter, 10Ks and half marathons, because I think they're within the realm of, kind of the normal amount of time you dedicate to something. I think it takes a certain personality type to kind of put in the time and effort and to become kind of obsessed enough about it to decide that this is and also to decide that they can put in the time and effort. But also there's a kind of, I love the word oblivion. There's a kind of point of oblivion you get to in an ultra marathon where everything becomes meaningless, everything else in your life except this movement. You come to this space where everything is reduced to just moving. You know, someone could tell you, "Oh, you left your car down there and someone's stolen it." You're like, "I'll deal with that later." You know, it's like, someone can tell you almost anything. You know, your house burnt down. You're like, "Okay, tell me that later. I'm dealing with this right now." You're in such a state of kind of everything's reduced to just the moment you're in, just the kind of present effort. You know, your worries about your bills, all that stuff, everything's gone. And I think there's a kind of, it's probably a similar state that people have sought in other things in the past. Maybe there's a getting away from your issues. Maybe there's a way of digging into your issues in these experiences. But somehow by stripping you bare, stripping you to the point where you can't just be polite with yourself, you can't just be kind of, just tip-tapping around everything, pretending everything's okay. You kind of stripped raw, and there's a kind of certain type of person who wants to go into that place and wants to be there and see what happens and kind of confront themselves and deal with those kind of things. And I think they're often maybe the same personality type that has perhaps tried other more difficult things, or maybe you had a difficult background, and this is a way of working through it. You kind of stripping away all the layers of that it's buried. Things that are buried deep down inside you can come out because all these other layers get stripped away. So there's a real intensity in that experience if you spend 24 hours or 36 hours or 48 hours out running, and you start getting sleep deprived, and you're in the mountains and you're tired, and all the niceties. I mean, I see people do really kind of gross things they wouldn't normally do because they're no longer being nice and being polite. And so, yeah, it's a really interesting question. It's one I've been grappling with, and I don't always give the same answer to the question because it really. And I would also say that not everybody who does ultra running is like this. There are some of the very good ultra runners are actually pretty stable, steady guys. I don't think you have to be like this to be a good ultra runner.
No,
But
I think no. Go ahead.
But I think if you have some kind of demons inside, or you have something you really want to get down to, or you just want to kind of get away from everything completely, it's almost like there's a brilliant Japanese author, Haruki Murakami, and he writes this slightly surrealist story where this guy discovers a well in the garden of an abandoned house, and he takes to sitting down in the well because it's so peaceful. And in some ways, I sometimes think of my ultra running a little bit like going down into that well. The rest of the world disappears, and it's just you, and you can think, you can think straight because no other voices are coming in. It's just you. So there are lots of reasons. I kind of gave about 10 different contradictory reasons there. So
No, but I think it's interesting. I think when people ask me why I run so much, and a lot of it is there's a couple reasons, but one of the reasons is because it's just me, and and when I was running that JFK 50 miler, I remember I was probably 20 miles in. I'd finished the Appalachian Trail. Now I'm on the C&O towpath, and I was you can't wear headphones on a trail run. You don't have any music in your ear. And I was on mile 20. I was all by myself. There was nobody around because I was middle towards the end of the back of the pack. All the ultra runners had gone in front. I'm a road runner. I'm in the back, and it took me 9 hours. But I was at mile 20, and I hadn't talked to a soul in 3 hours. I hadn't listened to anything.
yeah,
It's in the middle of the woods, on the top of the mountains. I'm freezing cold because it happens in November, so it's brutally cold here in Maryland. And I'm like, it's just you and your thoughts.
yeah,
And for 9 hours, I didn't talk to a soul. I didn't see I saw people every once in a while, but I didn't talk to anybody. I didn't listen to anything. And man, you know how much thinking you can do in nine,
yeah,
9 hours?
yeah,
How much, and especially in extreme conditions where you're
yeah,
confronting, hey, I want to
yeah,
quit, but I can't quit, like, because
yeah,
there's nowhere to go. I have to at least
yeah,
make it to the road. And so you're confronted with all those things that maybe have stopped you in the past, but you
yeah.
can't stop.
Yeah, and there are not many other times you go into that space, that kind of intense space just with yourself. And these ultras can go, they can go. I mean, the longest I've done so far is 43 hours in one go
Wow.
without stopping. So
43
you know,
hours.
you can start entering some really intense spaces, and then also you can kind of come through them, and you come into these kind of peaceful spaces as well. I remember, you have they call it the pain cave in ultra running. You come into this place where
Yeah.
it's dark, where you're digging, where you're kind of fighting, and you can't see, and you're thrashing around, and then you come out the other side, and there's just a kind of peacefulness. And I've actually that was one race, and some of my longest races, it's actually I've almost not wanted to finish even after 43 hours. Like halfway through the race, I would have given anything to finish. I was desperate to finish. By the time you get there, you're in such a state of kind of peacefulness that it was almost a bit disappointing to get to the end. I was like, no, I'm just getting this now. I'm just happy now. I'm enjoying this now. And I'd had 2 nights without sleep. I was, rocks were turning into animals. I was hearing the rain sounded like music, but I had this kind of overwhelming sense of peace from it. And that's happened to me a few times. And so, yeah, it's just like, it's almost like if you want to experience some intense experiences and kind of put yourself on the line, then this is one way of doing it. And it's probably, I wouldn't say it's healthy. I was going to say it's healthier than other ways, but it's still not. I still wouldn't say it's healthy. I don't think
No.
ultra runners do it for health. I think if you want to just be healthy, you run 3 or 4 times a week and you keep it
Right.
right.
Yeah, but I
Reasonable.
don't think
But
runners most ultra runners don't run for health. If
no,
you like watch Courtney Dauwalter and some
yeah,
of the stuff she puts herself through,
yeah,
she's not running for health.
no,
I
it's
think
not healthy. There was a survey where they asked ultra runners, if you knew for sure that it was bad for you, would you still do it? And 80% said they would still do it even if it was bad for them. Which they kind of know it is, really. I mean,
yeah.
you're beating yourself up pretty bad.
How do you and all the ultra running that you've done and the people that you've been around, how do you think most of them got started? Not, and what I mean by like I understand why they start, but how do they start? Like, how does somebody go out and just say, "All right, I'm going to train for 100 milers"? Is it
Yeah.
as literal as start with the first mile, or do you think they like go out and run 20 miles, 30 miles, and just keep upping it, or do most people the first ultra marathon they run 100 miles, they've never even come close to that, and they just suffer through it and until it becomes
Yeah.
the norm?
I mean, I think there's all sorts of stories, and I have a whole section in my book where I kind of talk to people who were way out of their depth when they did their
Right.
first ultra marathon. They didn't know what they were letting themselves in for, which in a way was me. There was me in the desert thinking I was going to be easy, and for 3 days being up near the front and competing, and then suddenly everything going wrong and being hit by the reality of it. And I've seen people enter running a race. It's not their physicality, but just you can tell by what they're wearing, the way they're running. They have no idea what's coming. They're totally unprepared for what's coming. And I think maybe everybody has to go through that to some extent. Uh, yeah, I mean, I think a lot of people who've done ultra marathons have done marathons. So in a way, it's not like they're coming from scratch.
Yeah, they
I
have
feel
some
like,
base.
yeah, exactly. I feel it's quite rare for someone to go straight to ultramarathons. Although the bigger it's getting, more and more people are doing that. But there's definitely a learning curve, a steep learning curve. And I feel like I've done now about 15 ultramarathons, and I feel like the last 3 or 4 have been the only one. The first time I've kind of really understood what it takes, and I've been having this experience where I'm near the end of the race, and I'm coming into these aid stations where they got the tables and the food, and I'm feeling fine. I'm like, I know what I'm doing. I'm within myself. I've still got the energy to complete the race, and all around me, all these people having complete dramas, crisis, crying, like legs in the air, getting angry. I mean, I heard one guy getting so angry recently, and I just started laughing because I've been there. I know what it's like. I know what all these people are going through because I've been there, and I feel like you almost have to go through that. You think you're not going to go through that. You think you're fine, but because you start off slow, it feels easy. Oh, this is easy. I could keep doing this, and even maybe for 50 miles, it's easy if you're doing 100 miles. It
Yeah.
always seems that it's all relative to the distance, but there comes a point in every race where it hits you like, this is hard, and I cannot go another step, and until you've kind of been through that, it's really hard to be prepared. I mean, there are things I could tell people to do, but until you've experienced it, I
Yeah.
don't think you can truly understand what these things mean. And things like stay in the moment, for example, right? So you don't think about the finish. That's a really bad thing to do, because you think that's a motivation in a marathon. Maybe that's a good motivation. You've got the finish, focused on the finish line. But here, this finish line is too far away, and
It's a
halfway
day
through it,
away.
yeah, and halfway through it, you realize the finish line is not getting any nearer. I'm barely progressing. I did a 100-mile race recently, and after 5 hours, some guy said to me, "It's getting serious now," and it was. It was a hot day. We'd been running for 5 hours. We were like tired. I was starting to feel a bit sick because of the heat, and I couldn't eat. And then I realized I still had about 17 hours to go. And that thought, it's like someone hitting you with a sledgehammer. That thought, it's like, poof, oh, and suddenly all the energy drains from you. It's like, I can't do this for 17 more hours. I mean, I can barely think about getting to the next corner.
Yeah.
But you can't think like that. You've got to get that thought out.
Yeah.
You've got to bin that thought instantly. You just think, okay, I'm here now, and I have to kind of have a few mantras or a few little check-ins. Say, well, how do I feel right this minute? Forget about the 17 hours. Do I feel okay right this second? Do I feel like I can carry on? Okay, I feel like I can carry on. Don't worry about how far I can carry on. Okay, well then I'll carry on. And then and then you just think, well, there's the next aid station is like 5k away, 5 kilometers, or whatever. And that's all I'm thinking about. I'm just going to get there and have some food, and then I'm going to think about something else. And so there are tricks, but I think even they're easy to tell someone, but to really be able to do that takes the experience of having kind of completely
Yeah.
failed to do it, I think.
Yeah, you have to learn. I remember I was doing this running challenge. It's called the Calendar Club, where you run, the day of the month in miles. So
Oh
first
yeah.
day, 1 mile,
Oh
2 miles,
yeah.
and I was finishing up. It was day 30, and
Yeah.
I was in Iowa, and I wasn't smart enough to do it in February, where it's the shortest amount of days. So I
Yeah.
did it, and so I did it on a 30-day month, and I was in Iowa. I was working, so I was like 3 o'clock in the morning, and I had to run. Uh, 28, 29, 30 miles. And so I remember each night I would get up and I'd go run. And there was a straightaway, and it was a 10-mile road, basically 10-mile
Yeah.
dead straight road in the middle of Iowa. And there were street lights. And I literally just started counting street lights. Just
Yeah.
count, like I was running to street lights. Right?
Yeah.
Just get to the next street light.
Yeah.
Just
Yeah.
get to the next street light. And for the next 3 days, every mile I ran, I was just counting street lights. That's all.
Yeah.
The worst thing I could think about was mile 30
Yeah.
when I'm on mile 10. I'm like, that's so far away. I'm dying. I can't feel my legs at this point. And I'm moving it. And so sometimes it's about breaking it down into small steps. But that's kind of a life lesson, isn't it? Like,
Well, I
don't
was just
think
going to
about the
say
end.
exactly. It's kind of like you hear this. This is meditation. Is all about being in the moment, being present. You know, in life, one of the best things you can do. I mean, I love that book, The Power of Now. And if you know that
Mm,
Eckhart Tolle,
love it. Great
and
book.
it's that is a really easy thing to say and to kind of think about. Yeah, I want to be present. I want to be aware of the present moment. But when you're in an ultra marathon, you're kind of forced into it. You kind of, it becomes, it's almost like that's the only way you can get through it eventually. You get to a point where you either quit or you stay in the moment. You've got two options.
Yeah.
And if you don't want to quit, that's the only way you can deal with it. And so it is it's a real lesson in doing that and being able to do that. And there are, there are things you can do. You can just like listen to your breath or count the next lamppost or just, but it is all about reducing everything down. That's what I was saying earlier. All that other stuff that your mind might be thinking about and playing with and wondering about. Eventually, I mean, when you go for an easy 5 mile run or 4 mile run in the week, you can have all those thoughts. Running is a good way of letting your thoughts go. But when you're in an ultra marathon, eventually all those thoughts disappear, and it's just keep moving. People are, what are you thinking about when you're out there? I'm just thinking about moving. My whole focus is on the next step. But that's an amazing place to be where, it's so hard. If you do meditation, it's really hard to stay with it because you're just sitting there and it's so easy just to disappear into your thoughts. Whereas
Yeah.
here, you can't. It's so the physical demands are so intense that you're forced to be in that
Right
moment.
there.
And so it's and that's something you can take with you, I think, into the rest of your life. I think you go out there and you have that ability to be present and to be able to deal with things in a much more present way. So when a problem comes, you're not thinking, oh, but this will mean that and that and that. You just kind of, okay, I've dealt with stuff. How do I deal with this? I'm right here now. This is the situation. This is how I deal with it. And you can be a bit calmer. And I've definitely found that. I think that it, particularly in the weeks, I mean, it does dissipate, but in the weeks after an ultramarathon, you kind of walk around feeling a bit like you did describe me as the Yoda of ultrarunning. You feel a bit like that for the first, maybe, it slowly dissipates, but particularly the week afterwards, you feel like, throw anything at me, I'm invincible. I can deal with it. I can absorb it and take it in, and I'm here, I'm right there. And then gradually, and then maybe that's why you have to go back and do another one to get back to that amazing state you feel in the week afterwards. You just kind of, you feel like you're kind of almost floating around. You've got this kind of wisdom somehow. You don't even know what it is, but you just have this sense of feeling aware of the moment.
Well, I think that's interesting because I did in the introduction. I said you're the Yoda of ultra running, and the reason I said that is because when you listen to your podcast, when you read this book, what you realize is that you're a really wise runner. Like, and I'm not talking about wise in the sense of, hey, let's talk about your strides and let's talk about your breath, but you put it in a way that makes it very easy to digest. And for the person who maybe not a runner, never ran an ultra marathon, maybe never ran a marathon, for them, I think what they get if they listen to your podcast, they read your book, is they get real wisdom, not knowledge. Knowledge being, again, how to run, but wisdom of what ultra running has done maybe for you. And the question I'd ask you is do you think that you're wiser because of the ultra running? Do you think going through the experiences of being in that desert, running the ultras that you've run, because of studying this, did it make you not just more knowledgeable in running, but do you think it made you wiser in, and this is maybe a grandiose question, but more wiser in life of like, I see things differently now?
Yeah, it's an interesting one. I mean, I definitely learned a lot through ultra running. And I think I learned about some of the fundamentals as well, about being present. So I guess, I mean, there's a story I actually tell in the book, which is quite illustrative, and it was before I'd done any of the ultra marathons. And like I said, the first race, I was there as the journalist from the Financial Times newspaper, and we turned up, and everyone else on this flight to Oman. Not that many flights at that time, particularly to this place. There were a lot of the people from the race were on this flight. There were probably about 40 like ultra runners on this flight, and we arrived, and we were met by one of the guys from the race, and he says, and I was told we would be met at the airport, taken to a hotel for the night, and then the next day we were driven to where the race was going to take place. So and we arrive at like 1 a.m, and I'm all fully expecting to be picked up, taken off to a hotel, as is everyone else. That's what we've all been told. And the organizer, comes out and he says, there's been a problem. The bus is delayed. It's going to be here at 6 a.m. And that's 5 hours away. And he says, so, you just have to wait until then. And I was like, what? Wait for 5 hours in this airport? And it was like air conditioned and, not particularly comfortable, not particularly fancy. It was Muscat in Oman. And I was like, and I was all getting a bit bristled, and I was about to say, I'm from the Financial Times. Do you realize, this is not good enough? And I turned around to get the support of the other ultra runners, thinking they would all be upset as well, because this was a real affront. Yeah. And there was no one there. And I was like, where are they all gone? What's happened? And then after I'd said my piece and walked off in a huff, I walked around and I realized what they'd all done. They'd heard that bit of news. They thought, 5 hours. Okay, I got a sleeping bag in my bag. That's 5 hours sleep. And they all just went and found a corner and lay down and had a little sleep. And I just thought that acceptance and that kind of willingness to deal with a difficult situation in a calm, rational way was something I wasn't able to do at that point in time. I kind of like to feel like now I would be a bit calmer and I would be a bit more like, I still feel like it was a bit bad that they told us to wait for 5 hours. Right. But I guess also those ultra runners were in the race mindset as well. They would come to race, so they were in that mindset where this is the first challenge already. We just deal with it. We don't,
And I,
you
and I think
can't.
that's the key, right? The key to
Yeah,
ultra running, separate from when I'm running, New York City or Chicago, when I'm running one of those marathons, I I don't. Yeah, you're gonna get hit with some challenges. They're all gonna be internal.
yeah,
Maybe the weather's not internal, but
yeah,
I'm not worrying about whether a bear jumps out of the woods. I'm not worried about whether there's a tree branch, a branch down, or a bridge out, or
yeah,
I have to wade through water. Like it's pretty clear. It's pretty safe. There's not
yeah,
like if I fall, there's gonna be a paramedic within 100 yards, right?
yeah,
But in ultra running, it's the unknown challenges
yeah,
that really separate it because you don't know what you're
yeah.
going to run into at any given moment.
Yeah, and it can be all sorts of things. You you lose your batteries for your head torch and it's dark and your torch runs out of battery. So like you got to deal with that, or you feel sick suddenly and you've got to find some different kind of food to eat. Yeah, there's all sorts of the things that have gone wrong are just they're nothing to do with running. They're like with a marathon. Yeah, you're in this kind of bubble which is running, and then
Right.
everything is within that scope. But yeah, ultra running, things are coming from every angle. It can suddenly get icy and you're like slipping over on the ice, and there's all sorts of challenges which you weren't expecting, and you've got to be able to be flexible, be adaptable, and you do learn that. And I guess whether I call that wisdom or just it's almost like accelerated learning, perhaps.
Mhm.
You kind of you learn about dealing with difficulties in life in a very fast forward way, but it also in a relatively safe way. It's not like you've had to go to war or you've had to deal with
Correct.
like some kind of you know crime that's been happened to you. There are people who've been in much more difficult situations, of course, and I do kind of sometimes feel like it can almost resemble a disaster zone. Some of the aid stations, particularly near the end of a race, and yeah, we've all paid good money to be being like kind of
Right.
dealing with a disaster situation, and then having to go out and carry on, and it's like a survival situation. But there is some value in that, in being able to do that in a kind of protect safe way that you're not actually having to deal with it. I mean, obviously, some people in this world have to deal with these situations for real, and
Right.
and they're probably learning a lot about themselves through that. But we don't want to all have to have our lives in real danger. So
Right.
it's a way of kind of experiencing that kind of real testing situation. And there's always, in some ways, I often think I joke with my wife because we sometimes say it's like there are definitely a lot fewer women in ultra running, and she, who's not a runner, thinks this is because women have to go through childbirth. So they don't have this need to kind of be in this
Right.
extremely difficult situation. And
Right.
then I joke that in some ways it's harder than childbirth. And hear me out, because
Oh,
hear me out.
you're a brave man.
I know.
Even if
I'm
I
only
thought it,
saying
I
this.
wouldn't say it.
I'm only saying, and this is said to my wife in a joking way. But because in childbirth you have no choice, right? You're like you can't just stop. You can't say I'm done, give up.
Right.
Where in ultra running you have that option. You have that option to quit, and so that adds another spin to it.
Yeah. Yeah. Oh, wow.
And which is good. You want that option to quit. You don't want to have to. It's not like you don't want your life to depend on it. But and in some ways that makes it harder
Oh,
because you've got that option, and to override that option can be the hardest part of the race in some
oh
way.
my god, I could not agree more. That is exact. It's interesting because when I ran that first ultra, and there were several times where I've just said, "Man, I wish I didn't have an option to quit," because having the
Yeah,
option to quit
yeah,
eliminates any excuses that it's not 100% on you. Like
yeah,
it's no, it's
yeah,
100% on you. You want to quit,
yeah,
you can quit anytime. You can walk off
yeah,
the course. Nobody's tracking you down and be like, "Hey, you have
yeah,
to get back on the course." They're gonna be like, "All
yeah,
right, make sure you paid and it's a DNF, right?" But having the option to quit challenges you in a way
yeah, yeah,
that if you didn't have the option to quit, it's like, well, I don't have a choice. I have to do
yeah.
it. That choice
And
sometimes puts you in tough
almost the
situations.
almost the hardest race I've done. So I've done these 24-hour track races where you run around a
Oh,
400-meter track for 24 hours.
yeah,
And
no way.
people think the hard thing about that is the monotony, but it's not the monotony. It's the fact that your aid station, where your team is, and also where the start and finish of the races, there's also an aid station, is every 200 meters. So every 200 meters, you can stop and you can sit down. And also because the race is timed rather than distance, you stop for 2 minutes, the race, that 2 minutes is still counting. So you can stop for 10 minutes and that 10 minutes is still counting. In fact, you could stop for an hour and you still, an hour of the race has progressed and you haven't done anything, but it doesn't matter. And so to get out, to keep getting yourself out there and keep passing that aid station and your team, and there are people set up tents in case they need to sleep. And I've got this coach. He's like, "Don't set up a tent." He said, "What are you doing? Set up a tent. You're going to use it. Don't give yourself that option." If you're like,
my gosh, so good.
and so that's what's so hard about that race. Whereas in a like your JFK race,
Yeah.
so, well, pretty much most ultra races, you as long as you're moving, you're progressing to that finish line.
Correct.
And probably the next place you're going to see someone is going to be in 5 miles or something, and so you got 5 miles to get through, and then you're going to have a little break. You're going to talk to someone. You're going to eat something, and then you got another 5 miles. Whereas in this, it's every 200 meters.
Oh, there's no way. That would be way too tempting for me.
The first time I did it, I probably ran about 4 miles in 4 hours at one point. And I was so disappointed with myself afterwards. I had to go back and do that race again a few years later, and I did much better. I was much better. I didn't stop for more than 5 minutes at any time.
It's like the runner's marshmallow test. If you ever read the book, The Marshmallow Test, right? It's like, I got 2 marshmallows. Like way too much temptation to have an aid station. I was doing that calendar club a different time, and I've done it a couple times. And I was on day 30. I was at home, and I made my wife drive me 30 miles up the trail. And then leave.
So you got no choice.
Drop me off 30 miles in Pennsylvania, and I'll meet you at the finish line in 6 hours. And don't come back, right?
Yeah.
I mean, until I get there, because I knew that if I had a car and I parked in the middle or I made it an out and back, it was gonna be way too much temptation just to be like, I've done enough and I'm done, right?
Yeah. So you're battling with this all the time in these races, Shall I stop? Can I stop? Do I want to stop? And then they talk about the why. So then you start going, well, why am I doing this? Who cares? I don't care. You stop caring. You think, I don't want to do this. I don't want to do this anymore. Why am I doing this? And then runners say, you need your fuel, you need your training, you need your running shoes, and you need your why. And it's this really good reason for when you hit that crisis point. Why am I doing this? What is the purpose for this? And if you haven't got that clear, you can really be in trouble. And I definitely... So I had some of the races. So in one way, I had the book was part of the why, although there were times where that ceased to mean anything. It wasn't strong enough at times, and I was like, I don't care about this book. It's just a book. But I had this goal to run this race, the UTMB, which is this big race you've got to qualify for. And some of the races I was doing were qualifying races, and other ones weren't. And it was definitely easier in the qualifying races, because if I didn't finish those, I wasn't going to get to this race, which was the big climax of my book. So in those races, I had this clear goal. I had to get this race to qualify for the next race. But then there were other races which I was doing for other reasons. And then I was a little bit like, and I even had this extra temptation to stop, because then I thought, well, it would be quite good to write about dropping out of a race, having a DNF, stopping. That would be a good experience. So this is the race where I drop out, and I'd had that thought, and then it's kind of interesting to me, why didn't I do that? Because in a way that's true, and I ended up finishing all the races, and then then that's when you start reflecting on yourself, and you start thinking, what is it? And I've heard a lot of ultra runners talk about being very stubborn, and I think I have that stubbornness as well. You kind of you just know that you've set out to do this, and you're just going to do it, whatever it takes, and it's almost like a feeling inside yourself that you just have. It's almost like you're cheating yourself if you drop out. No one else cares. I know my wife doesn't care. My kids don't care. People reading the book, like I say, it would be quite interesting to see how you feel and think about it. But something in me is like, I'm doing it for me. I'm doing it for something in me wants to. I said it's doing it, and so it's going to do it. And I describe it as stubbornness, but maybe it's something else, something slightly different. I don't know.
So you think your why? So your why now? The book is written. You've run all the races, right? You've run some of the hardest races. You've run plenty of ultras. What is your why now? Like what is the what is the are you signed up for one in 23?
So I'm signed up for the toughest, well, the longest race in the world, which is 3,100 miles long. I don't know if you've heard of it. It goes around one block in New York
Oh,
City.
oh yeah. Oh yeah. The longest
Yeah,
race ever, just around
yeah,
the block. Yep.
around the block. Yeah,
What's it called? It's called
it's called the Self Transcendence
yeah.
3100,
Yeah, that's right.
and it's 3,100 miles. And when I say I'm signed up, I'm provisionally signed up. I
Yeah.
have I've got a lot of training to do between now and then. Uh, and what my why is, I don't know. It's like part of it is curiosity. There's a I did two ultra runs this year, back to back, with just a few weeks between them. And the first one was much easier than the second one. And the reason was that the second one I'd just done an ultra run, and I was suddenly like, why am I doing another one? I don't need to do that. I've just done, and they were both 100K in the mountains in France. I was like, I did one. I really enjoyed it. I had a really good race for me. One of the first times I didn't really get into too many difficulties. So then suddenly I found myself out there doing it again, and I really, I mean, it's complicated. I did have a why for the first one, and the second one I didn't really, and I managed to struggle through, but it was tougher. But with this 3,100 race, the why is, it's almost like that state I talked about, that state of peacefulness, and that's the race is actually set up with that consciously as part of the goal of it is to kind of, I mean, it's set up by the Sri Chinmoy marathon team, who had an Indian guru called Sri Chinmoy, who's now dead, but they all meditate, and so there's a kind of spiritual element to the race, and I feel like I kind of want to explore that. I want to see what happens. I've been describing it as like it's like taking this journey to the end of the line. It's like the last stop, the furthest you can go. I mean, in theory, you can run further. Of course, you can.
You got
And
3,200
actually,
miles.
actually, amusingly, because it's 3,100 miles, and in the UK we work in miles as well, so that's fine.
Yeah.
But for a lot of the Europeans who do this race, they work in kilometers.
Right.
And 3,100 miles actually translates to 4,958 kilometers. And so then they decide, they get to the end, they go, well, I might as well get to 5,000
That's
kilometers,
right.
right?
That's
It's
right.
only like another,
I'm not
it's
stopping
only
at
another
this.
38K. So I'm sticking to miles. So in theory, and there is a woman, a fascinating woman called Rosie Swale Pope, who I had on my podcast, who has actually run, as far as I know, the furthest of anyone I know. She ran around the entire world. That was 20,000 miles. She's an interesting character. But in terms of a race, it feels like this is like the end of this is like you're taking running to
Another level.
another level, and it's just I just want to know what happens. What do you feel? What do you experience? And particularly as the whole race is supporting that. It's like it's not like you're just out there on your own doing that. The other people who do the race are really exploring running in the same way, and so I kind of like that idea that you're just all going to be together. I mean, there's not many people do this race; about 10 or 15 people do this race each
Correct.
year, but you're all
And very few finish it, right?
yeah. I mean, I've been watching it the last couple of years online, and they tend to. So there's a 52-day cutoff, and a lot of them tend to, even if they're not going to make the distance, they carry on for the 52 days, but they end up running like below the
Yeah.
actual
The
distance.
3,100 miles.
But if you get to 3,100 miles in fewer days, then you stop
Yeah.
unless you want to get to 5,000 kilometers. So the record is like 40 days.
So just for those of you listening, just to make sure you understand what we're talking about. So it happens in New York City. It
Yeah.
is just a New York City block,
Yeah.
correct? And
Yeah.
you run around it, and until you hit 3,100 miles. Which
Yeah.
how big is the city block?
It's like half a mile.
Half a
It's a
mile,
small
right?
block.
Yeah. So it's you're literally running around this city block, 6,200 times. I
Yeah.
think it's right under a half a mile.
Yeah.
So 6,200 times you have to run around this block
Yeah.
in 52 days. Now people are saying, well, how do you stay awake for 52 days? You don't. You sleep,
Yeah.
you get up, you
Yeah.
run, you eat, you run, you sleep, but
Yeah.
you don't leave. You don't leave the block. Is that correct?
Well,
You could.
so the race, you can, but you don't want to go too far. So you might be the next block a lot. You got to find somewhere to stay. Like you got to have a little base somewhere nearby.
Right.
And yeah, you kind of to get to that distance within the 52 days, you've got to run 60 miles a day on average. So that's a lot of mileage.
Let that sink into everybody.
Yeah.
3 marathons a day, 2.75
Yeah.
marathons every day for 60 days straight
Yeah.
in New York City.
Yeah.
In what time of year is it?
Well, luckily they've moved it to September, October because it used to
Yeah.
be July, August.
Yeah, I thought it was in the summer.
Yeah. So it's so now you get, like before it was all about the heat, heat, and then kind of storms. But now it's definitely easier, but then you can get quite cold days and that.
Well, that's unbelievable. So I know we're running out of time, but let me ask you a couple more questions. So what do you think in doing all this research, running all these ultras, being around the people you run around? What do you think are the and you haven't had time to think about this question, but what are the top 2 life lessons you've learned in in all the research you've done, in all ultra marathon? What are the 2 life lessons, not running lessons, but
Right.
life
Right.
lessons you've learned?
Well, I would say I'd say one is as much as possible if you can, particularly in a moment of difficulty, if you can be present in the moment, in the present moment. We've talked about that, and you can just not think too far ahead. I mean, there is a time and a space to let your thoughts go off, into the future and the past and deal with that. But I think when you really want to get something done and you're really challenged, the best thing you can do is be present. And the second thing is that when you think you're done, when you think you've used up every last ounce of energy that you've got, when you think you're finished, you're not. And I think having experienced that, I've realized that you get to that point, and I've actually looked into the science of this, and there is actually evidence that this is how the body works. It basically tries to shut you down before you need to be shut down because it wants you to keep something in reserve. Okay, so that if an emergency happens and the way we evolved, if a lion or something jumps out, you might think you've done everything you can do, you're finished, but suddenly if a lion jumps out, you get out and you start sprinting. So that energy is always in reserve. So what happens is, and that can not just be physical, that can be mental, and in all sorts of walks of life, areas of life. Your body can start protecting you by shutting you down. It can tell you you're too tired, you haven't got the energy, you've done enough, you can't go on, you've had enough, you can't stand, that thing you have to do any longer. You can,
There's more.
and so there's always more. There's always more. I think it is a real lesson, and I've been there to the point. I learned that lesson to the point where I actually kind of joked to myself, and I said, I start getting these thoughts. Oh, I'm done. You can't carry on. You can't carry on. Or I start pretending something's hurting. This is my brain starts saying, "Oh, your legs are hurting," and I just laugh to it. I say, "You've got to try harder than that. This is only stage 1. We're going to go through this like 10 more times. So just let's get this one out of the way. Like we know I'm not done. Okay, just get over it and let's go."
Love that.
So yeah. So those 2 things. One, try and be present and still and in the moment and just aware of what's going on around you in that moment, not thinking about all the millions of implications. And 2 is that you can always, there's always more in reserve. You just have to let the brain have its little kind of tantrum, its little moment, and then you carry on. And you can,
I always think that the second one I love it because I'm a big believer in that, and I always think when I'm struggling and I think that I hit the end, I think of my
yeah,
car, right? And
yeah,
when the gas thing hits empty, that's
yeah,
the manufacturer's way of saying, hey, you're close
yeah,
to the end. But there's
yeah,
always they always have an extra gallon reserve that is
yeah,
beyond the empty tank, right? It's not like you
yeah,
hit empty and like the car stops.
yeah,
They have reserves for the jackasses in life
yeah,
who want to take it to empty, right? And
yeah,
so that's your brain's empty. For me, I'm always thinking,
yeah,
well, I just hit the brain's empty signal. I
yeah,
know there's more in reserve. Let me see how much.
yeah,
Let me see how much God. Let me see how much
yeah,
God put in that reserve tank for me.
yeah. And I think it's a brilliant, interesting, a brilliant analogy. I haven't heard that one. I like that a lot. But I think our empty reserve is actually bigger than the car, because the car is, it's
As a
probably
gallon.
about a tenth of the tank maybe,
Right.
whereas we're probably still only at halfway, to be honest,
Agreed.
when the empty gauge is flashing.
When
So
that empty gauge is empty, your maker, whatever you believe, your maker has
yeah,
given you a huge empty
yeah,
tank, a
yeah,
reserve tank that's
yeah,
beyond what the stated limit is, right? So
yeah,
you believe you're limited to this. And what's
yeah,
interesting is I've tested this. Like I
yeah,
keep, and maybe that's the idea with the ultra runners and people that
yeah,
push themselves in these kinds of sports is for me, what I'm trying to figure out is if you believe that there is no limit that you can hit. Like you can literally just keep on growing and getting better and whatever you want to do.
yeah,
Why not keep? For me, I keep pushing it to see, well, how far is my reserve tank? Like how
yeah,
much really is beyond? Well, you can only get that. You can only find that out if you push yourself to the reserve to get to that next level, right? So if you stay
yeah,
in your comfort zone, like if I always fill up the
yeah,
tank when it gets half full, then
yeah,
I never get to that empty signal to
yeah,
really find the growth. Does that make sense? And that's
yeah,
probably a long
yeah, yeah,
analogy with a car, but
yeah.
that's what I'm looking for.
And there are times, when you've got the option to refill, you can refill. But what ultra running is putting yourself in that situation where you haven't always got the option,
That's right.
and it's kind of useful to know, to have that knowledge that you can go there if you need to.
Yeah.
Oh, there are times where actually I could do this tomorrow, so I could go to bed now. That's fine. But there are other times, no, I really need to do this, but I can't. But then you go, yeah, I can do this now. I can do this now. I have to do this now. I can do it now. And it's good to have that knowledge that you can do it if you need to. I mean, there's nothing wrong with taking a rest if you need a
No.
rest, and you've got that option. But it's having the knowledge
What's
you got both.
What's interesting is for me when I first started running marathons. I remember I was getting ready for my first marathon. I never run a 5K, a 10K, anything. I just started with the New York City Marathon, and I would train, but I would only train when the conditions were perfect. If it was sunny out, if the weather was right, if I felt good, if I had a twinge in my ankle, I was like, oh, probably not. I shouldn't
Yeah,
run today, right? And I talking to Charlie Engel, and Charlie said, I told him that, and he goes, "You're doing it backwards." And I was like, "What?" He said, "No, you don't not train when the conditions are hard. You purposely train when the conditions are hard." He said, "So
yeah,
I want to flip this whole thing for you, right?" He said, "If you're gonna not train, if you're gonna not go out on the day that is perfect to run, when the sun is shining, the birds are chirping, take that day off. But if it's raining, it's pouring, it's cold outside, it's snowing, it's icy." He said, because you don't know what the conditions are going to be on that race day. He said, so you want to train in the harshest environments. And so what I realized was now, even if it is a day, the days that I don't want to do it, the days when it's pouring rain, when I'm exhausted, those are like the signal that says get your ass up and go, because this is where growth happens. Your growth happens in
yeah,
the hard.
yeah. It's like extra training in a way. It's like you're not only dealing with the running, but you're dealing with all the issues around it. And I think particularly for ultra running, yeah. Sometimes if I'm tired, I think, well, if I run when I'm tired, that's what I need to be practicing.
Right.
So this
Because
is
I'll
like
be
good. This is
tired.
Yeah, this is like double training. This is me training when I'm tired. I mean, there is a kind of contrary. I think there's a balance to be struck as well. I think you can. There is a risk of overtraining in running, and that's a
Of
whole
course.
nother conversation. But yeah, I definitely there's a. I see it. If it's raining, exactly. I see it as like, well, this is an extra element to deal with. So I'm getting more out of this training session than I
Yeah,
would
I'm
if
going
it
to
was
push it
just
even more.
easy. Yeah, I'm learning
Yeah.
more. I'm pushing myself more. So
Awesome. Well, thank you for coming on. I got a couple final questions for you. But the rise of the ultra runners, a journey to the edge of human endurance. Absolutely unbelievable. You got to check it out. All right, two final questions for you, and that is, if people want to follow you, if they want to find you, if they want to get more of you, where do they do that? And again, you don't have to be a runner to
yeah.
get something out of the Yoda of running. You can listen to his podcast and get great takeaways like you did on this podcast. But where do people find you?
Yeah, well, the podcast is thewayofthерunner.com. And then I also have adharanandfinn.com as well. So,
Yeah. So let me ask you. Well, I was going to say ask you two online. I'm going to ask you three. What do you say to somebody that's sitting on the couch right now, or sitting in their car, or maybe getting ready to go for a run, and they've never run an ultra? but they want to. What's the first piece of advice you give them?
I mean, an ultra is not. Oh, God, that's a. I mean, if they want to, they're halfway there because an ultra is not any in terms of running. It's not any harder. I mean, it's about the mind. So if you want to, you're halfway there. So just do it. I mean, the further you go, the slower you're running. It's not like if you run a marathon, you think I couldn't run another step. Well, you can run another step because you're going to run the first marathon slower, so you can get there. The thing you've got to work on is your mind, and I think embrace it as an adventure rather than a race. Don't start thinking about time and position, but treat it as an experience. Which I think if you want to run an ultra marathon, is probably where you're thinking anyway. But I think of it as a journey, particularly your first one. You just want to get to the finish. You don't start trying to win the race or trying to be competitive because if you're coming from a road background like me, you're probably gonna start thinking these guys are really slow, but they're slow for a reason because it's really hard. So just treat it like a journey, like an adventure. Take in the sights, the sounds, and embrace the process. I think is what I would say. If you turn out to be brilliant at it and you start being near the front of the races, sure, then you can start treating it more like a a race. But initially, just go out there and enjoy it. I think.
What would be your suggestion for somebody's first ultra? They're going to do an ultra.
JFK. Which one you mean?
Yeah. So yeah. Which one? Somebody's going to do their
Yeah,
first ultra.
yeah.
Which one would they do? And they're here. Let's say they're here in the United States. What's the ultra they do?
Well, I would probably say the JFK 50. I mean, it's not too hilly. It's 50 miles, right?
Yeah,
Which is a
50
good
miles. Yep.
distance. I feel like if you do 50K, you're kind of, it's not that much further than a marathon. You're not, you're perhaps
It's
not
qualifies
entering.
as an ultra, but it's not really. I'm
Yeah,
saying.
exactly. So JFK 50 is a great one. I did a race, a 100K race in California, the Miwok 100K. So I'd give a little shout out for that. That's a great race starts off in Stinson Beach in Marin County. But yeah,
JFK. JFK. That was
JFK
my
is
first.
yeah, it's the oldest ultra in America. I think it's got a history to it. It's 50 miles. It's apparently beautiful. I don't know. I haven't done it, but
Beautiful.
yeah,
Beautiful.
and it's not through mountains, so
No.
it's challenging but not mountainous. So
Yeah.
it's
The
not
mountains start in the beginning. First 20 miles is on the trail, on the Appalachian Trail,
okay.
but then the rest is completely flat. It's on the scenic
Yeah,
towpath. So,
yeah. So
uh,
it's a good one, definitely.
all right, last question. Adharanand Finn, thanks for coming on. Last question, and that is 50 years from now when you leave this earth, 60 years from now when you leave this earth, what do you want your contribution to have been?
Ooh, that's a tricky question. Wow. uh, well, I mean, I guess if I've encouraged people to enjoy, to get out, get up off the sofa and get out into the wilds and go and live a fuller life. I guess and I feel like ultra marathon running is not the only way to do that by any means, but it's one way to do that. And even even 5K running, any running is a way to get out there, get out, feel the wind in your face. I think every time someone does that, they're enriching their life. So if I've helped people to do that and continue helping people to do that, that would be amazing. I think that's something amazing.
Awesome. Adharanand Finn, The Rise of the Ultra Runner. Check out his podcast, The Way of the Runner. Buy the book today, The Rise of the Ultra Runners. Read the rest of them. Great human being, great runner, and the Yoda of all things, all things running. Thanks, Adharanand.
Thank you, Chad.